Imagine growing up on the run from the FBI and the police because of what your parents are doing. Well, that is the remarkable story of an award-winning new podcast that is out by Crooked Media. The podcast is called Mother Country Radicals. It's by Zayd Dohrn. His parents, Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dohrn, were political radicals who were leaders of the Weather Underground, which took some responsibility for trying to bomb the Pentagon and Capitol Hill and leading protests. Here's a clip of the podcast now.
In 1970, a 28-year-old recent law school graduate became the most wanted woman in America.
Angela Davis was replaced on the FBI's 10 most wanted list this afternoon by Bernadine Ray Dohrn, described as an underground leader of the Weathermen.
They said she was an enemy of the state.
Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
A homegrown terrorist.
A bomb exploded early this morning in the Pentagon.
J. Edgar Hoover called her the most dangerous woman in America.
I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war.
She's also my mother. I'm Zayd Dohrn, host of the new podcast, Mother Country Radicals. Listen and follow for free, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Wow, and Zayd joins us now. First of all, congratulations on how well received the podcast has already been with the Tribeca Film Festival Awards and whatnot. First of all, Zayd, what was it like growing up on the run, and how did that shape your childhood?
Yeah, I mean, it was very strange on the one hand. On the other hand, I guess like all kids, I was born into it. It took me a while to realize that it was abnormal. My parents never hid from me the fact that we were on the run from the FBI. They never hid that they were political radicals, but I'm not sure I knew exactly what the FBI was, why it was chasing us, kind of a childhood boogeyman more than any kind of political organization I could have defined.
What prompted you to do the podcast? I mean, there were people who say, oh, was this somehow therapeutic? Was this trying to get some answers from your family? I mean, why now?
Yeah, I mean, there were two reasons, really. There was a political reason and a personal reason. And the political reason was that, I started it during the Trump years. I was thinking about how young people resist a government that seems to be taking the country in a dangerous direction. And of course, I had my parents as an example. And actually, as I was working on the podcast, I started talking to people, not just my parents and members of the Weather Underground, but members of the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army. And one thing I realized they all had in common was that they had been initially radicalized by police violence against Black people here in America, by the killing of Fred Hampton, by the murder of a young kid named Clifford Glover in Queens in 1974. And as I was doing this research, of course, George Floyd was killed. We had this racial reckoning on the streets, and it started to seem like this is really a story that should be told now. The personal reason was my parents are getting a little bit older. It was during the pandemic. I was separated from them. And there were questions I thought, like, if I'm ever going to ask them these questions, I should really ask them now, and I should preserve their voices for my daughters and for the next generation of activists.
So what were some of those questions and what were their answers?
Yeah, I mean, there were some difficult questions about, why they would decide to have a kid when they were fighting a violent revolution against the United States government. My mom was literally on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. So it was a dangerous situation in some ways. And so I've always wondered, even though they were very caring parents, very loving to me, I've thought a lot about why they made the choices they made. In fact, my adopted brother, Chase Boudin, he came to us as a 1.5-year-old because his parents, who were my parents' friends, had left him with a babysitter and gone out to rob a bank with the Black Liberation Army as part of their revolutionary activity. So I was very aware of, the risks that they took and the consequences for kids. And I wanted to think about that. I'm now a father. I was curious, what was going through their head and how I could try to understand my own family in that context.
And what did your mom say about, sort of your curiosity? I mean, how did she respond when you say, look, given the life you were leading, why have a kid?
Yeah, these were complicated, sometimes painful questions and conversations we had. When I first started talking to her, I asked her, how does it feel to have me starting this project, digging into your past? And she said, I think very honestly, I'm kind of glad you're interested in us at all, the way some kids are not interested in their parents, but it scares me. It scares me for you to dig into this and to kind of, how you might think of it, how you might judge us. But, in the podcast, I get into these conversations with her. I mean, I not only tell the story of my mom going from, a straight A student, a cheerleader, a law student, all the way to the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, but I also have these conversations with her about, why did you make these choices? What was going through your head? And I think what's interesting about the podcast is you really get a sense of how somebody is radicalized, what makes a relatively ordinary middle-class kid from a small town in Wisconsin into a radical willing to go to war with their own country. And I think it's obviously relevant in terms of a lot of things that are going on today.
So let's pick up right there. How did your mom from Wisconsin, straight A student, get radicalized and go from that life to where she ended up on the FBI's most wanted list?
Yeah, well, it was a complicated journey. I mean, she was an idealistic law student at the University of Chicago. She joined Martin Luther King's rent strike when he came to Chicago to try to, fight back against the slumlords who were taking advantage of tenants here in Chicago. And while she was marching with Dr. King, she saw, people in Chicago, white people throwing stones at him, hitting him with rocks and bricks. So that was part of it. She also became friends with a bunch of activists here in Chicago, including Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Chicago Black Panthers at the time. They were comrades. She was running SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which was the biggest anti-war student group in the country at that time. And she was part of Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition. He was putting together this group of activist organizations that could work together across color lines. And then he was murdered by the Chicago police. So that really kind of radicalized a lot of people, my mom included, that this charismatic, brilliant, young Black activist could be killed by law enforcement. I think she felt like we have to do more. We have to put our own lives on the line if this is what our government is capable of doing.
Has her perspective and the perspective of your dad, has it changed through the years? Now that they sort of go back and look at the 1970s and when you were very little, now that they're talking to you as a grown-up, I wonder if their perspective has changed much.
Yeah, I think it's changed in some ways. I mean, they're still political radicals. They've spent their whole lives, ever since we turned ourselves in, they surfaced, but they have stayed activists for the past 4 or 5 decades since then. So they still consider themselves people, committed to change, committed to anti-racism. They are determined to see a different version of America than what we have now. But I think they have regrets, and I talk about this on the podcast. I asked them, what they would have done differently, what mistakes they made. And, they're pretty honest and forthcoming with me about, how they look back on those times now.
Are there any things about how they raised you that they regret or that they wish they had done differently, or any things that you wish that they had done differently?
That's a good question. I think, I had a good childhood, believe it or not. I mean, even though it was strange, even though there was this kind of danger hovering over it, they were good parents and they raised me in a way I always felt cared for. I felt relatively safe. It was only looking back that I realized, how dangerous things had really been. I think they regret taking some of those risks. And I think some of their friends, not just my brother Chase's parents, but I talk on the podcast to Kikuya Shakur, who's Assata Shakur's daughter. Assata Shakur is still underground today in Cuba, after 40 years. And so, it's quite painful to talk to her daughter and realize Assata has never met her grandchildren. So a lot of these people, not just my parents, but a lot of the revolutionary people I spoke to, they destroyed their families. Their work really had personal consequences. And part of the podcast is wrestling with that question of what you're willing to give up, what you believe.
It sounds like it is a very sort of nuanced podcast and a very complex set of feelings. But I wonder, a lot of people may say, well, does Zayd take pride now in what his parents have done? And that's part of this. Or is it sort of a podcast that talks about your sort of bewilderment or sort of the confusion that you had to live with?
It's both. It's both. I mean, I think it is very much about trying to understand people who are very different from me. I mean, I'm not a political activist in that way. I'm a writer, an artist. I think of myself as somebody who's interested in what drives people and the complexity of that. My parents are very committed, very certain people. And so part of it is me trying to understand, where did they get their certainty? How did they decide to do these things that by any measure were very extreme, very radical? But yeah, I mean, what I'm proud about, I'm not proud of every decision they made. They would be the first to admit that there were tactical mistakes along the way. But I am proud that as white activists, they put themselves on the side of anti-racism, that they worked with the Black Panthers and other groups to try to kind of change this country long before a lot of white America realized how deep the problem of white supremacy was here.
And given the problem right now of racism still across the United States and police brutality and on and on and on, I wonder if what they think, your parents, and also what you think, frankly, about Black Lives Matter and where the effort for activism and racial justice stands right now.
Yeah, I think they're very encouraged, very optimistic about movements like Black Lives Matter and like Sunshine Movement and March for Our Lives. Young people taking to the streets to demand change today. But I think, they would be the first to say they're still learning from younger activists. They're looking to this next generation of people to tell us, how we can change the world now, how we can make it better. And I think one of the things the podcast does is try to give, young people today both a history of revolutionary activism in the 60s and 70s, but also kind of a roadmap for the mistakes they made, the things that they did that were kind of questionable morally or tactically, but also the inspiration of the kind of courage they showed. Again, not just my parents, but I speak to Angela Davis. I speak to Jamal Joseph, who was a member of the Panther 21 and the Black Liberation Army. And these are people who really, in some ways, risked and sometimes sacrificed their futures, their families, and their lives for this cause. So I think it is inspirational in the sense of looking at people who really put everything on the line to change America.
Zayd, tell us all, you've got 4 episodes that were released at the Tribeca Film Festival, and now you're doing one a week. How long does the podcast go? How long are the episodes? Where can people find it?
Yeah, there's 10 episodes in total. They'll be released every week, everywhere you get your podcasts. So Amazon, Apple, Spotify, Odyssey, you can get them anywhere and they're free. But, right now we have 4 episodes out, and then you can follow once a week to see how the story unfolds. And it really goes to some crazy places. There are bank robberies and car chases, and they break Timothy Leary out of prison at one point. It's really a wild story that I think even people who know this history might be surprised by.
And real quickly, are your parents listening to the podcast?
They are. They're listening in real time. They've only heard the first 4, and so they don't know how it ends, but they have been listening along with the rest of the country.
That's great. What a terrific project. The podcast is Mother Country Radicals by Crooked Media. Zayd Dohrn is behind this. What a remarkable story. And Zayd, thanks for joining us in the conversation. We appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.